continue answering those questions. So without further ado, let's dig into the true nature of the climate crisis. So now, I title this The True Nature of the Climate Crisis because I believe that before we can take effective action, we have to understand what is truly going on, what the true problem is that we're trying to solve. Only then can we take effective action. And that is my whole goal today, is to give you tools for effective action. This is about empowerment, okay? And so this is where we're going today. Why aren't we changing? Why is the world failing to act on climate with anywhere near the speed and resolve that science demands? And there's a lot of wrong answers floating around to this question, a lot of bad climate information out there. So I'd like to help clear a few things up today. Let's start here. What is the climate crisis not? The climate crisis is not a scientific problem. Take it from me, we're not stuck in inaction because we don't know enough. We know plenty. The fact that carbon dioxide absorbs the same infrared wavelengths of radiation that the Earth emits, thus trapping its heat, has nothing to do with politics or economics or religion or belief. It's just a fact. We've known about it for well over a century. Now, climate change is also not a technology problem in terms of our solutions, which may come as a bit more of a surprise. But what I'm showing here is new data from Michael Thomas, who's a renewable energy expert. Take a look at solar energy's exponential price decline. In 1975, solar was so expensive it would have cost you over $1 million to install a solar array on your rooftop. But by 2020, the International Energy Agency was reporting that solar was the cheapest electricity in history. According to a recent report by Energy Innovation, it's now cheaper to build a new solar farm than to operate an existing coal-fired power plant in almost every part of America. And what does that incredible price drop lead to? Well, vast expansion in solar energy. In about 20 years, global power generation from solar grew by more than 1,000 times, creating the fastest energy change in human history, which is, incredibly exciting. Now, a few years ago, Bill Gates, currently the world's 5th richest man, decided he was going to turn his philanthropy toward the climate crisis, which is fantastic. But he came out and said a misperception that's still all too common. He said, we need an energy miracle to fix the climate crisis. Well, people from the climate movement who've actually been paying attention to what renewable energy engineers have achieved basically slapped their foreheads and said, no, Bill Gates, we don't need energy miracles. That makes it sound like at the moment we have no choice but fossil fuels, which is bogus. So Michael Liebrick, who's a global renewable energy expert, he responded, come on, Bill Gates. Solar's price has dropped 400 times and solar deployment is up 1,000 times. How much more miracle-y do you need your miracles to be? This is our miracle. It has arrived. And I could show you comparable miracle graphs for wind power, for battery storage, for electric vehicles. The renewable energy revolution is moving so fast, it has demolished the predictions of the world's energy experts. That's not to say there's not a big role for emerging technologies. There is super exciting and promising things happening with the next generation of geothermal, next generation nuclear, smart grids that manage electricity demand, and much more. But the point is, technology is not what's holding us back. As Mark Jacobson from Stanford has published roadmaps for every nation on Earth and every state of the union to convert to wind, water, and solar power with existing technology, entirely to renewables with existing technology. These roadmaps would create far more jobs than they would eliminate, and they would save millions of human lives, mainly through the reduction of air pollution, which causes some 10 million premature deaths every year around the world. Give that a second to sink in. It's a Holocaust every single year. It's 1 in every 5 deaths on planet Earth. By the time I finish this talk, over 1,000 people will have died from breathing the poison that's emitted whenever we burn fossil fuels. It is a public health crisis beyond anything in world history. Even if climate change weren't happening, any sane society would be working overtime to prevent these millions of entirely preventable deaths. There are so many reasons beyond climate change to make the renewable energy transition. So we create jobs, we save millions of lives. Oh, and as an added bonus, we avoid the catastrophic impacts of climate change. Really hard to see what's not to like about this. So again, the question is, why aren't we doing it? Well, to understand that, we can turn to the work of Bill McKibben, one of our greatest living climate warriors. In 2012, McKibben published a sobering article in Rolling Stone, which I consider about the most important climate change article ever written. This was the cover photo of that issue of Rolling Stone. Justin Bieber, hot, ready, legal. But if you look in the top right is an article called Global Warming's Terrifying New Math, in which McKibben lays out 3 numbers that clearly show the true nature of the climate crisis. Now, these numbers have changed in the past decade. This article is outdated, but the takeaway, the message remains absolutely spot on. So the first number, 2 degrees Celsius. This is our safe ceiling for average global temperature rise relative to pre-industrial temperatures. In other words, this is how much we can warm the planet before Armageddon really hits. Spiraling extreme weather disasters, famines and droughts that kill millions and displace so many more that it creates a refugee crisis beyond imagining, the death of all coral reefs on the planet, the melting of the ice caps, the flooding of Earth's coastal cities. That's our world at 2 degrees. To put this in context, so far we've warmed the Earth about 1.2 degrees, but it's important to understand even if we stopped emitting tomorrow, the planet would continue to warm to perhaps 1.5 degrees. There's a lot of inertia built into something as massive and complex as the global climate system. So we've already locked in around 1.5, and our limit is 2. The second number, 565 gigatons. This is the amount of additional carbon we can emit from here onward and still stay below the 2-degree threshold. That is, this is our carbon quota. Basically, if we burn less than this, we're kind of okay. If we burn more, it's Armageddon. Now, each year, humanity emits something like 35 gigatons of carbon, or 35 billion metric tons. And if you do the simple math, you'll see we don't have a lot of time to screw around before we surpass this carbon quota, especially considering this article was written a decade ago. Here's how Greta Thunberg summed it up, our carbon budget, in a recent video. Any of you old enough to remember Gangnam Style? This was the first video on YouTube to ever reach 1 billion views. Well, that video was longer ago than we have left to avoid climate Armageddon at current rates of emissions. The third number, 2,795 gigatons. This is the amount of carbon that would be released if we dug up and burned all the proven fossil fuel reserves, all the coal, oil, and gas that nations and fossil fuel companies are sitting on. Now, this carbon is technically still in the ground, but as McKibben points out, it is economically above ground. It's the basis of fossil fuel company share prices on the stock market. Companies are borrowing against it, trading it, using it as collateral. Entire nations are basing their budgets on it. In other words, this is the amount of carbon we're planning to burn. And it won't have escaped your notice that 2,795 is greater than 565, 5 times greater. On the right is the amount climate scientists say is safe to burn. On the left is the amount we are planning to burn. This is what Greta Thunberg means when she says, I want you to panic. But listen, before you panic, take a look at the implication here. What this implies is that in order to have a hope of staying within the 2-degree limit, in order to avoid climate Armageddon, we have to leave 80% of the proven fossil fuel reserves in the ground, right? Does that make sense? We know that 5 times more than can be safely burned is under our feet, so we can only burn 1/5 of it. 80% has to stay in the ground. But here's the kicker. Here's where we come to the fourth number. That 80% of proven fossil fuel reserves, known as the unburnable carbon, represents some 20 trillion in profits to the fossil fuel industry. Now we can begin to see the true nature of the climate crisis. Try telling ExxonMobil or BP or Chevron they have to leave $20 trillion in the ground. You might think they won't like that very much, and you'd be right. And they're going to fight tooth and nail to ensure that the number we burn is the one on the left and not the one on the right. So let's dig into the true nature of the climate crisis. I know it won't surprise any of you here to learn there are close ties between the fossil fuel industry and government. Now, this could be any of dozens of governments around the world. We have an international audience today, particularly those of fossil fuel producing nations or US states. But for the sake of argument, let's call it the US federal government. There is an exchange going on here. There's an arrow going in this direction. What does the fossil fuel industry do for government? Well, the big one is campaign finance. In the US, the disastrous 2010 Supreme Court decision Citizens United redefined corporations as people and redefined campaign contributions as free speech, thus allowing corporations to pour virtually unlimited and undisclosed amounts of money into elections. There is a tsunami of dirty money sloshing through our government. The industry spent tens of millions on the most recent election cycle, the 2022 midterms. We don't even know how much because so much goes through dark money channels so that its source is obscured. Campaign finance is legalized bribery. I pay to put you in office. Now I own you, bought and paid for. I scratch your back, you better scratch mine. Closely aligned is lobbying. This is, according to Open Secrets, the oil and gas industry spent $124 million lobbying the US federal government last year and a whole bunch more to state governments. This is just the various ways that the industry pushes for policies that benefit them. Now, there's another arrow going the other way. What does the government do in return for the fossil fuel industry? Well, how about subsidies, tax breaks? According to the International Monetary Fund, the fossil fuel industry globally is subsidized to the tune of $13 million every minute. $13 million every minute. Think about that. Subsidies make fossil fuels artificially profitable for fossil fuel companies and artificially cheap for consumers. So we're happy to fill up our giant gas guzzlers. Remember this next time somebody crows about the free market. They'll tell you renewable energy is great, but it just can't compete on the free market. Well, ain't no free market when fossil fuels are being subsidized at $13 million a minute. How about, just an example, quick latest headline, $36 billion in profits. Can anyone please tell me why we're still subsidizing this shit? Okay. How about policy? Policies like being able to drill on federal lands, reduction of oversight and regulation, not having to disclose, for example, the slurry the fracking industry is pumping into our groundwater. Policies that crush the competition, like making it harder to purchase electric vehicles or more expensive to add rooftop solar, and on and on. And especially under the Trump administration, we saw political appointments. That's people from the fossil fuel industry coming straight into government. That's when the government says, we don't even need to make the beneficial policies for you. You come right in the door of the Capitol building and do it yourself. An almost unbelievable example is Rex Tillerson, who went directly from the CEO of ExxonMobil to US Secretary of State. Whose interest do you think he was pushing as America's most powerful diplomat? Us, the voters? I have my doubts about that. And around this nefarious circle we go. And out of this nefarious circle, of course, is spawned climate change denial. There's nothing grassroots about climate denial. It comes straight from the top. Lies peddled by the fossil fuel industry to cast doubt on the science and delay action. We'll see more about this. Over the past few years, we've seen more and more revelation about Exxon misleading the public and its own investors. This is very well documented. And so you get headlines like this one from The Economist. Fossil fuel barons have poured more than $100 million into these races, raising concerns about special interests. I mean, that's the understatement of the 21st century. Special interests run our government, in particular the fossil fuel industry. I remember going to see Al Gore speak when I was at Stanford University. Powerful speaker. I'll never forget his words. He said, we can't solve the climate crisis until we solve the democracy crisis. And we have one. In the United States, we do not even live in a full democracy. We live in an oligarchy where the wealthiest industries control our government, where they can buy power, where they can buy policy. The climate crisis and the democracy crisis are one and the same. So let's mention a few of the actors in this democracy crisis that drives the climate crisis. In my opinion, these are the two greatest climate criminals in world history. Here are Charles and David, the infamous Koch brothers, who made their fortune on oil and gas. Well, actually, they inherited their fortune, like most billionaires, from their daddy. They used that fortune to thoroughly corrupt the US government, creating, in effect, a private mega bank for conservative politicians. If you sign on to their extreme neoliberal agenda, the centerpiece of which is ferocious resistance to any climate action, well, then the piggy bank is open. But if you dare to do anything to help us avert climate catastrophe, they will buy your replacement into office. These two are the primary reason why the modern Republican Party in the US refuses to take any climate action ever. As just one example, their political network poured almost $1 billion into the 2016 presidential election. I think you all know what happened in 2016. Let's just say they got what they wanted. Now, how about the Honorable Senator James Inhofe, one of the great granddaddies of climate denial from Oklahoma, a major oil and gas producing state, infamous for calling climate change, quote, the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people. Then, when it snowed in Washington, D.C., he brought a snowball onto the Senate floor as proof that it's a hoax. Why would he try to convince the American people that climate change is a hoax using such an idiotic stunt? Easy. The fossil fuel industry paid him to. He took nearly $500,000 from oil and gas for his latest reelection. And again, that's only what's trackable. Now, I consider Senator Mitch McConnell to be the third greatest climate criminal in history after Charles and David Koch, with whom he's closely aligned, by the way. He spent his career as the Republican Senate leader, turning the US Senate into the greatest tool of climate obstruction the world has ever seen. Through the anti-majoritarian composition of the US Senate and anti-majoritarian tools like the filibuster, he ensured that for decades, the US Senate never passed a single piece of climate legislation nor ratified a single international treaty to slow the flow of carbon into the atmosphere. His obstruction was finally overcome in 2022, as we will see. Now, why would Mitch McConnell spend his entire career blocking climate action? Easy. The fossil fuel industry paid him to. And he took around $250,000 for his latest reelection. I can't imagine what that number would be if we had the full scope. By the way, do you notice anything, other similarities between all these climate criminals other than their fossil fuel ties? They're all rich, old, white men. When you understand the world in this way, the links between patriarchy, white supremacy, and a fossil fuel economy, the links between climate justice and social justice become very clear. The point of all this is there's no longer any clear lines separating the fossil fuel industry from government, and there's a word for that blurring of lines, and that word is corruption. And you don't have to take my word for it. The corruption of the US government that drives the climate crisis is copiously documented by some of our best investigative journalists. I'm always tickled looking at these titles and seeing that all these brave journalists are women, a fitting contrast to the old white men we've just surveyed. I think it suggests a common sense change to our global leadership, don't you? And it's not just here in the United States. Although the US is in some ways uniquely corrupted by the fossil fuel industry, this is more or less true of governments of every major fossil fuel producing nation. It certainly includes Australia. If you look at the Morrison government's love affair with coal, it includes England and Canada, obviously Russia. And I know we have participants here today from India. You're probably already aware of the cozy relationship between Prime Minister Modi and coal baron Gautam Adani, one of India's richest men. Here's an article about the Modi government granting Adani the ability to mine coal in one of India's densest forest patches. This even though India has all 10 of the world's top 10 worst air polluted cities and is widely seen as the single most vulnerable nation to the climate crisis. Just this year, dozens have died in a heat wave, tens of thousands were displaced by a cyclone. But when you're the Modi government and your goal is not particularly to protect your forests, your people, or your climate, but to protect Adani and his billions, what do? Attack and jail people who are speaking out against coal. Now, this is a predictable result of corruption. And what is the result of all this corruption here in the US? Well, policies that favor the fossil fuel industry and kill renewables. Now, thankfully, we're no longer living under the Trump administration for now, which was so corrupted by the fossil fuel industry, it would have been just comical if it hadn't been so tragic. Just stacking every environment and energy government position with fossil fuel goons like Scott Pruitt and Rick Perry and Rex Tillerson, more old white men who spent their time just destroying American environmental protections, most notoriously withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, which thankfully Biden's administration has rejoined. But once you start looking at the world through this lens of corruption, you're just going to see it everywhere. Every time you open a newspaper or scroll on your phone, the examples go on and on. Koch pull the plug on electric cars. Rooftop solar dims under pressure from utility lobbyists. The Koch brothers are still trying to break wind. A Koch-fueled attack on electric buses picks up speed. We can't even get electric buses in this nation without the fossil fuel industry coming in on the attack. I mean, what chance do we have? Killing public transit projects around the country. And if your blood's not already boiling, pipeline to the classroom, how big oil promotes fossil fuels to America's children. It's sick. It's just nauseating. It's not just financial or political corruption, it's moral and spiritual corruption. And as the wealthy world adopts renewable energy and electrifies their economies, big oil sees the opportunities in poor African nations where they're working to drive up use of fossil fuel cars, buses, and planes. They call it the Oil Demand Sustainability Program. They're like drug dealers, pushing their deadly products, trying to addict as many nations as possible before the world catches on. Big oil tells us again and again, they're just innocently supplying the world's insatiable demand for energy. That's bullshit. They're out there every day creating that demand by ensuring that our collective response to the climate crisis fails. Well, part of maintaining demand is advertising. The industry recently launched its Lights On energy campaign, over $100 million in pushing the myth that fossil fuels are reliable, that they lead to energy security, and that they are vital to our future. None of these are true. The real goal, of course, which the American Petroleum Institute is quite clear about, is to, quote, dismantle policy threats to the industry, which is to say, to kill climate action. And as the World Meteorological Organization was reporting that 2023 was the hottest year ever experienced by the human species, how was big oil responding? By walking back their already meaningless climate pledges. So, after exploring a couple wrong answers, we now have the right answer to the question we began with. Why aren't we changing? The fossil fuel industry won't let us. We are not held back from solving this crisis by a lack of scientific understanding or a lack of technology or because it will hurt the economy or destroy jobs. The climate crisis is a political crisis because the fossil fuel industry, with its vast amounts of money in our broken political system, can buy power, can buy politicians, can buy policies that lock us into fossil fuels. So that's why I'm here telling you that the fossil fuel industry is the enemy in the climate change fight. Their business model is based on burning 5 times as much carbon as the atmosphere can safely hold, and they know it. And I hope I've convinced you in the last few slides, they have no intention of changing that business model. These corporations will not stop. They are incapable of stopping. All corporations can do is seek profit. They have no moral code. They have no conscience. Leaving $20 trillion in profits in the ground is impossible. They will watch the world burn before they give up their profits. That is the true nature of the climate crisis. In the climate change battle, fossil fuel corporations are the enemy. Now, one of the first questions that comes to our mind when we see a statement like this is, wait a minute, we all use fossil fuels. Most of us have cars, we fly on planes, we eat food that was shipped from other climates. Therefore, we're all complicit in climate change. How can you rail against fossil fuels when you use fossil fuels? This is a very natural response, and it's an extremely important point, and it's one we're going to dive into right now. A very important paper came out in the scientific journal Science a few years ago by Elise Amel and her colleagues. They're environmental psychologists, which I think is a cool line of work. And what they imagined in this paper was an individual person who's looking to do their part to help change the world, to help solve the climate crisis. But more interesting to be specific rather than general. So let's return to Bill Gates as an example. Now, Bill Gates, in addition to being a very successful computer nerd, is also a renewable energy nerd. So let's say one thing he likes to do to cut his personal carbon footprint is put solar panels on his house or his mansion. Now, Amel and colleagues define various spheres of influence a person can have. The first is the private and personal. Okay, so this is the classic reduce, reuse, recycle level of action that we learned about in kindergarten. For Bill, it means putting solar panels on his house, and that's great. Maybe he wants to think a little bigger. He might look to the next circle and encourage his friends and neighbors to also put solar on their house. Bill will help them learn their options, navigate the permitting and financing, understand the benefits. But that might not be enough. He might move to the next level and actually start a community organization dedicated to rooftop solar. He starts up a co-op to share solar costs and resources among the neighborhood or even the whole city. And they do community education about the benefits of rooftop solar, like lower electricity bills, because with net metering, the utility pays you for adding power to the grid. Well, if that wasn't enough, now Bill Gates decides to run for president on the rooftop solar platform. And when he wins, he's going to introduce legislation that everyone in the US has to install rooftop solar. If that sounds far-fetched, California already did it, for all new homes at least. And eventually, after Bill does enough work of spreading the rooftop solar gospel, we reach the biggest sphere of influence, which is cultural. This is when we don't even need a law on the books forcing us to install rooftop solar, because of course we're going to have solar on our homes. That's our culture. If you don't install solar, you're not part of our tribe and you can leave. You're shunned, because we are solar people. That's part of our founding myth. Well, notice the most revealing thing about this diagram is that they put an axis on it. Notice that the axis goes from smallest impact at the top to largest impact at the bottom. And what it shows is that personal action is the smallest level of impact that a person can have. If we want to fix climate change, personal action cannot be all that we aspire to. This is a global, systemic problem that requires global, systemic solutions. Think about what we've seen so far. Do you think fossil fuel executives are operating on the private and personal level? Do a thought experiment with me, okay? Imagine you are the board of directors of ExxonMobil. So get into character. You're all old, rich, white men, okay? And I'm the chair of the board. And I come to you, it's our quarterly board meeting. And I say, here's the strategy for growing the company, fellas. We're going to use more fossil fuels as individuals, okay? We're going to always use plastic straws. And I want you to never bring reusable grocery bags. Always get the plastic ones. And we're never going to buy the organic yogurt, okay? And never ride a bike, always drive. And I want you all to commit to eating a bloody steak instead of a salad at least 3 times a week. And I want you to commit to taking long showers, at least 15 minutes long, okay? And if we all do our part, that's going to increase demand for fossil fuels just a little bit. And that's going to make ExxonMobil more profitable. What do you think? I mean, you think that's how they're operating? It's absurd. It's absurd that they would operate that way. And yet, that's how we operate all the time on our side. Now, I'll tell you the levels where the fossil fuel industry is operating on. They're operating where the real power is. They're operating on the public level, influencing elections through donations, gaining political appointments, lobbying, fueling voter suppression efforts, stacking the Supreme Court with conservative justices who are going to kill climate action. And they're operating on the cultural level by funding a sustained campaign to create a culture that distrusts science, and advertising to create a culture where to be a man, you have to drive a V8 F350 truck that gets 8 miles to the gallon. So if we're stuck up here wailing about our personal carbon footprint, and they're down there where the real power is, that nefarious circle will just keep on turning. That's why touting the personal carbon footprint to ourselves, to our friends and families is actually a disservice because it's a false tool. This is what the fossil fuel industry wants us to believe, that it's our fault because we all use fossil fuels, and that the only way to solve things is to change ourselves. Because as long as we believe that, we'll be stuck trying to change as individuals without changing the system, and they can keep right on drilling. So if the personal carbon footprint is the least effective tool in our toolkit, why has it taken over the narrative? Why does everyone obsess over it? Surprise! It's because of the fossil fuel industry. You want me to really blow your mind? The whole concept of the carbon footprint is a fossil fuel industry invention conjured up by BP in 2005 in a $100 million ad campaign. Here's what that ad campaign looked like. Look how they shift the blame. Call it your mark on the world. CO2 emitted due to your daily activities. Meanwhile, they're absurdly rebranding themselves Beyond Petroleum, even as they continue to lobby the government and fight tooth and nail against any policies to reduce the systemic addiction to fossil fuels. This ad campaign was 19 years ago. How do you think BP has done since that time at moving beyond petroleum? Well, let's take a look at a recent headline. BP dials back climate pledge amid soaring oil profits. By the way, they quietly dropped the name Beyond Petroleum. Now they're just BP, because the old ways were just too profitable. This is where it's at. Mary Haglar, great young writer, young woman of color, one of our best environmental writers. This is where it is. I don't care if you recycle. We've been talking about recycling and other personal actions for 3 decades. In that time, carbon emissions have skyrocketed, growing by over 50%. It's time to realize it doesn't work. We have to change the system, pull it up by the very roots of injustice, inequality, and unchecked corporate power. Here's the takeaway from a hero of mine, Bill McKibben. This is the most common question he receives as one of our most dedicated climate activists on the planet. He gives a simple answer. Become less of an individual. Join the movement for climate justice. So what does that look like? Well, this is the true nature of the climate crisis. Even though it's infuriating, I also find it empowering, because once we understand this, we understand that fixing the climate crisis is not as complex as we've been led to believe. It really comes down to one thing: breaking these arrows. Simple. Not easy, that's for sure. Definitely not easy, but simple. The climate crisis is about power. Who has it? Who doesn't? Do the people have power through free and fair elections and representatives who actually listen to them? Or does the fossil fuel industry have the power by buying politicians and lobbying them to block action? If you only take one thing away from this presentation, take this. Our task is to take the fossil fuel industry out of power. So what tools is the climate movement using to break this circle? Well, spoiler, it is not reusable grocery bags, okay? I'm going to share a few of them. This list is not exhaustive. I'm not going to cover important tools like pipeline protests or climate storytelling through literature and film. I'm not going to cover litigation, the dozens of cities, states, and nations that are suing big oil for damages. These are making real change. But I am going to cover a few of the other real tools. How about real tools number 1? Clean electrification. It is a very exciting time to get involved in climate because, as I said at the outset, our energy miracle has arrived. Building the new energy future is how we make fossil fuels irrelevant. In Europe, renewables just overtook fossil fuels in the electricity sector, which nobody would have predicted even a few years ago. This is no longer alternative energy. We're no longer, celebrating a few solar panels on some hippie's roof. We're talking about powering entire continents, which is, of course, exactly the scale we need to be thinking at and building at. Now, when we say clean electrification, which is really our core climate solution, it has 2 components. First, the clean part: build vast amounts of clean electricity, solar, wind, nuclear, batteries, geothermal. And second, electrify everything. Electrify our society, electrify our households, our workplaces, the places we live, work, play, and pray, our heating and cooling, our cooking, our transportation. So switching to the electrify everything side of the equation, California is getting in on the act. This announcement coming in late 2022 is a big deal, following earlier announcements by Norway, India, Japan, the UK, and many other nations. That's because California is the world's 5th largest economy and among the world's largest car markets. Now, is it better to have walkable and bikeable cities? Oh, yeah. Is it better to have robust public transportation that's clean and efficient and free? You bet. I hope that in the coming decades, the US will take steps towards far fewer cars, which improves mental and physical health and quality of life in so many ways, as shown by the amazing things happening in Paris and Amsterdam and other cities that have taken impressive steps to limit the number of cars. But when trying to change the world, we start from the world we have, not the world we wish we had. And in the world we have, especially here in the US, is dominated by cars. And in that world, this chart showing the exponential growth of electric vehicles is very, very, very good news. It has led the good folks at The Economist to eulogize the internal combustion engine, and mostly because of the explosive growth of EVs, the International Energy Agency now projects that peak oil demand is just around the corner. Soon, globally, we will at last begin burning less oil on this planet. Thank God we've been working for that, praying for that, hoping for that, fighting for that for a generation and more. And it's finally going to happen. Now, right now, some of you are thinking, well, wait a minute. What about all the minerals it takes to build EVs and deploy renewable energy? Aren't we just trading one extractive economy for another? The answer is an emphatic no, we are not. A renewable economy requires as much as 1,000 times less total extraction. What I'm showing here is the total amount of fossil fuels humanity digs up and burns each year. This is for 2019, very similar to today. It totals around 15 billion tons. Now let's compare that to what we have to dig up for a renewable economy. In 2020, that totaled around 7 million tons. And even with aggressive deployment of renewables through 2040, it's a tiny, teeny fraction of what we dig up for a fossil fuel economy. Now, I don't want to minimize the real concerns about mining lithium and cobalt and other minerals for renewables. Just because it's 1,000 times less extraction, it doesn't mean we're not going to dig some new holes. And digging those holes causes real problems and should be done in as environmentally and culturally sensitive ways as possible. But please, come on. Whenever we talk about mining for renewables, we must put that in the context of what we're doing today, which is 1,000 times more damaging, 1,000 times more harmful to ecosystems, 1,000 times more human rights abuses. The fossil fuel-based economy is wildly inefficient. Why? Well, at least 3 reasons. First, no fossil fuel is recyclable. It just pours its byproducts into our air and water, whereas solar panels, wind turbines, and especially batteries are increasingly recyclable. Okay. Now, a far bigger impact is summed up by this quote from Thomas Edison. Burning things is inherently wasteful. A typical internal combustion engine vehicle is usually close to about 25% efficient at turning the stored chemical energy of gasoline into motion, meaning 3/4 of the gas we burn serves no useful purpose. It just burns up in heat and friction, polluting our world while doing no work whatsoever. You know how efficient an EV is at turning the chemical energy of a battery into motion? About 95% efficient. Perhaps most important, when you build a solar array, yeah, you had to mine some minerals in order to build that solar array, but now your job is done. The energy just comes to it, flowing out of the sky like a damn miracle every time the sun rises above the horizon. Contrast that with building a coal-fired power plant. Now, building that plant still requires mining and resources. Yeah, you had to build that plant, but once you've built it, your job is just getting started because you have to keep digging up, refining, and transporting its fuel forever. You want me to blow your mind again? How much of global shipping, super tankers, trains, long-haul trucks, do you think is just moving fossil fuels around to be burned? The answer is 40%. That means by moving to a renewable economy, nearly half of global shipping will simply vanish. It shows how efficiency makes new gains possible you might not even have thought of. Remember, there are so many reasons to move to a renewable economy, even if climate change were not a thing. So wait a sec. If the renewable economy is so much more efficient and requires so much less extraction, why do we have this persistent narrative about the disaster of mining for renewable minerals? Surprise, the fossil fuel industry is behind it. They've largely moved from lying about the basic science of climate change to lying about the solutions, trying to discredit renewable energy, make everyone believe it's just as bad as fossil fuels. Don't buy it. Now, when it comes to clean electrification, you can get in on the act. If you live here in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act will give you financial incentives to get an EV, rooftop solar, an electric water heater, a heat pump, which is the most efficient way of heating and cooling a house, or a magnetic induction stove to get those poisonous flames out of your kitchen and keep your kids from getting asthma. You can break up with fossil fuels. You can banish them from your daily life. It's not me, it's you. Real tools number 2. Finance is the newest front in the climate wars. As Bill McKibben puts it, money is the oxygen that fuels the climate crisis. Take away their financing and the fossil fuel industry can't operate. The preeminent group called Stop the Money Pipeline, they have particularly targeted Chase Bank, which is the world's biggest fossil fuel funder. They've lent fossil fuels over $300 billion since the Paris Agreement was signed in late 2015, an agreement they purport to support. It goes without saying that this is inconsistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement. They are financing climate destruction along with all the other major banks, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Citigroup, Morgan Stanley. Not one of them has stopped pouring money into fossil fuels. This is something you can think about, by the way, at your personal or household level. The big banks are so entangled with fossil fuels that Bank Forward estimates if you have just $125,000 in the mainstream banking system, that money is doing more damage to the climate than all your other activities. Eating meat, flying on planes, buying things on Amazon, because your money is being used to finance fracked gas pipelines. So one of the most impactful actions you can take at the household level is to move your savings, investments, and retirement plans somewhere climate friendly. If you contact me, I can provide resources for taking this step. Closely related to pressuring the big banks and money managers is divestment, one of the best places for young people like students to plug into the movement. Divestment means organizations are pulling their investments and endowments out of the fossil fuel industry and reinvesting them elsewhere. Students come to their universities, like these students from Oxford in this image, they come with a simple message. If we want to move the world beyond oil, gas, and coal, we have to stop investing in oil, gas, and coal. Duh. And we're seeing big wins. Harvard, CSU, the largest university system in the country with nearly 500,000 students. Vassar, Dartmouth, Reed, Boston University, and more. And how about Jesus versus big oil? I think we could use Jesus on our side right now. The Church of England divests. To date, over 1,500 organizations, religious organizations, cities and towns, nonprofits, especially colleges and universities, have pulled out of fossil fuels. Over $40 trillion worth of assets. This is not fringe. It is mainstream. It's the largest movement of its kind in history. Most of you are connected one way or another with an institution with investments or an endowment, a church, a college or university, a pension fund. You can push them to align their investments with their values. Real tools number 3. Political mobilization is perhaps the biggest lever we have to make change. That's because governments write the laws. No amount of nonprofit work or shifting markets or individual action or voluntary carbon offsets can match the power of city, state, and federal governments to enact policies to end the fossil fuel era. The rules of the game right now heavily favor fossil fuels, and only governments have the power to change those rules. If we elect climate champions, we get climate action. It's as simple as that. Let's take a look at 2 quick examples from the United States, starting with the state where climate deniers hold power, Texas. What do climate deniers do when they have power? Try to kill the booming renewable energy sector. Compare that with Michigan, which in 2022 midterm elections gained a trifecta for climate champions, which is to say Democrats. They now control both state houses and the governorship. So what do they do with that newly earned power? Well, pass ambitious clean energy goals. This never would have passed if climate deniers, which is to say Republicans, had power in either state house or the governorship. If they had had power to block it, they absolutely would have. The climate crisis is about power. It's not complicated. Everywhere you look across the US and the world, it's the same story. If you want ambitious climate action, elect climate champions. But the US federal government may still be the most powerful on earth, and in a generation, for 35 years, it did virtually nothing about the greatest crisis to face humanity. And in fact, what it did was to block international action. It made it much, much worse. So the Sunrise Movement, the political arm of the youth climate movement, took it on in this run up to the 2020 election. Sunrise elevated climate to the top of the Democratic agenda, to the point that every major presidential candidate on the Democratic side in 2020, our most recent presidential election, swore off fossil fuel donations. This is a big, big deal. Our current president, Joe Biden, is the first in a century who has not been bought and paid for by the fossil fuel industry. And that's exactly why he had by far the most aggressive climate agenda of any presidential nominee in US history. The climate crisis is about power. Who has it and who doesn't? A headline like this is a sure indication that the fossil fuel industry's power is waning. Better yet, thanks to tireless organizing by Sunrise and dozens of other groups and thousands of individuals, Biden takes office in 2021 with a bare majority in the US House and Senate. That's called power. And what does Biden and other climate champions do with that power? Well, they pass the Inflation Reduction Act with hundreds of billions of dollars for the green transition. It is a huge deal, an absolute game changer. It's possibly the biggest piece of climate legislation in world history. This is what you get when you build sufficient political power. You get action. It can't be repeated too many times. The climate crisis is about power. If climate deniers had had just one more vote in the US Senate, they would have blocked this bill. It's not even a question. And now the Heritage Foundation and other right-wing partners have brought us Project 2025, the plan, among many other dystopian policy goals if Trump wins, to repeal the Inflation Reduction Act, gut the EPA, eliminate the Department of Energy to hamstring the clean energy transition, eliminate drilling regulations, and much, much more. Just an absolute wish list for the oil and gas industry. The corruption is so blatant on this campaign trail. Trump met with a bunch of oil CEOs and he said, give my campaign $1 billion and I will give you anything you want. We cannot let this happen. If this happens, I mean, we're at the end of the line here. If this happens, the world plunges into climate chaos. Okay, game over. The good news is we have a dynamic, exciting candidate who is leading Trump in the polls, although we should not kid ourselves. This election will be extremely close. We have 70 days. You want to do something for climate? Don't keep your powder dry. Don't wait. This is the moment. Get involved now. Leave it all on the field for the next 70 days because we can't get those days back. And if Trump wins, it's game over. Okay. But how to get involved? It's unclear because, as most of you probably know, the US presidential election is decided by this ridiculous mechanism called the Electoral College, which disenfranchises most Americans. In 43 of the 50 US states, your vote doesn't matter. It only matters in 7 swing states: Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. If Kamala Harris wins in enough of those states, she wins the presidency. Now, Pennsylvania is emerging as the most important of those swing states. So I am traveling there in October to speak on climate change at colleges and university campuses to try to rally young folks to vote and to get involved. Now, how can you get involved? If you happen to live in a swing state, sign up right away to volunteer with the Harris Walls campaign, to make calls, to knock doors. If you don't live in a swing state, sit down and make a list of everyone you know in swing states, all your friends, family, acquaintances, colleagues. Call them up or text them and say, hey, this is the most important election of our lives. Are you thinking of getting involved? Here's how you can get involved. We all have to do everything we can for the next 70 days. Here's the ideas that I have for you. Again, contact everyone you know in the 7 swing states. Encourage them, yes, to vote, but to go beyond their one vote. Our one vote is not enough for the future of the planet. We have to put in a little more legwork than that if we want a livable future. Donate, okay? If you're in a position, if you've got a little extra cash kicking around, there are many, many different orgs doing great work. I'm just going to point you to 2 that I am donating to and that I think are doing some of the best bang for the buck. You know, you can donate to the Harris Walls Victory Fund, but that fund is going to have hundreds of millions of dollars in it. You know, your $50 is going to buy like 1/500th of a second on some TV commercial. So where is the most effective bang for the buck? To me, there's a couple of them. Pennsylvania is emerging as the most important must-win state for Kamala Harris. Turn PA Blue is doing great get out the vote work in Pennsylvania. Highly encouraged. They need our support right now. They really do. Climate Cabinet is a great organization. I know some of the founders. Climate Cabinet, it steers people towards down ballot races for state governments, local governments, things that are overlooked that people don't put near as much resources in as the presidential election. But these key races are happening in swing states, in Arizona, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania. And if these state and local officials win, well, that's all the better for Harris. So this is a place where your money can go a long way. And volunteer, okay? So a couple of places. Vote Forward is where you can write letters to voters. I enjoy that. I enjoy it way more than phone banking. Phone banking kind of sucks. Nobody wants to hear from you. But Vote Forward is a cool one that I recommend. And again, volunteering, sign up to volunteer for the Harris Walls campaign. You don't have to do this. You can be anywhere in the nation to do this. You don't have to be in a swing state, although it helps. So please use me as a resource. I want to help you get involved. I want to make everything we can of the next 70 days. This is the greatest crisis ever faced by humanity. Who wants to face it alone? Not only will we be ineffective, we'll be sad and lonely. You know, we are a social species. We need the bonds of community. When we join the movement, we find that solidarity is a wonderful balm for the hurt of climate grief. This is my wish for you, that you find your place within the climate movement. Starting in the next 70 days, your place in the movement will be different from my place in the movement. You know, people out there want to tell you the one best thing you can do for climate. They'll say the one best thing you can do is vote, or the one best thing you can do is go vegetarian. This is bullshit. It completely misses the mark. First of all, are you supposed to just go vegetarian and then ignore the world's greatest crisis in all other aspects of your life? But more importantly, it totally ignores that we all have different passions, skills, and roles that we bring to this movement. What are we good at? What do you love to do? What fires you up? Do you live in a swing state? Are you a CEO of a company? You know, there's a place in this movement for artists, engineers, office workers, janitors, executives, everyone. When done right, the climate movement is empowering, inspiring, even fun. You know, you can get a community climate group together and you need not just cry on each other's shoulders. You can celebrate the wins together, go hiking together, laugh together, have cocktails together. And that's the big one, is to celebrate the wins together. And there are a lot of climate wins happening these days. We need another one on November 5th. And when we all join the movement, we're going to win that better world. Thank you so much for your attention. That was a lot I threw at you. I really appreciate it. I'm going to turn my video back on, and I'd love to take your questions. Hello.
Thank you, Zach. That was really inspiring and great. Love to hear your talk always. We have 2 questions, I guess, in the Q&A, but folks are also welcome to ask questions directly on the Zoom.
Great.
I will go ahead and maybe take the questions on the Q&A first, and then we can take live questions.
Thank you.
Perfect. So Laura was asking, what's your view on the role of activism, movements like Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, Green New Deal, Rising, etc., on breaking the link between fossil fuel industry and governments?
Thank you for that question. I would say that activism means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So I wouldn't say that the only activists are from Just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion, but that is a key part of activism. Activism is also the grandmother who wants her grandchildren to grow up in a livable world, who is writing postcards to voters right now in Georgia and Pennsylvania and trying to sway this election. That is also activism. But activism also means, chaining yourself to a pipeline or gluing yourself to a road blockading traffic. There are many different forms of activism. Activism means that you are active in this fight. And like I said, there are so many different roles. Now, in terms of what I would say those organizations are is not just activist organizations, they are nonviolent civil disobedience organizations. So they, as in the great tradition of the anti-apartheid movement of in the 20th century, nonviolent civil disobedience has really come of age in the 20th century with the civil rights movement, with the classic example of nonviolent civil disobedience is Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus, or and that this was also in the India independence movement. So many forms of nonviolent civil disobedience that can also mean blockading the path of a pipeline. Now, with that long preamble to your question, what is the role of that form of activism in breaking the link between the fossil fuel industry and government, breaking that nefarious circle? Well, to me, the biggest thing that they're doing is not so much stopping a particular pipeline or blockading a particular bank to get them to stop financing fossil fuels. Those are important victories, but what they're really doing is expanding the knowledge, expanding the visibility of this crisis by generating media. Okay, this is exactly why Martin Luther King Jr. led protesters across the bridge at Selma and made sure that video cameras were there to show peaceful Blacks being beaten down by white cops and dogs, because that created a crisis for the Johnson administration, because these images were all over television and it was like, that doesn't look so good, and helped lead to the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. It's the same for the protests at the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, which happened in 2016. And peaceful protesters defending indigenous homeland, well, and trying to ram an oil pipeline through indigenous homeland during a climate crisis, sicking dogs and firing rubber bullets and shooting water cannons at these peaceful protesters in freezing temperatures. It wasn't the best look. It's not. Why are we doing this? Is like a police state pushing fossil fuels over the will of the people. And it got a lot of media attention, and it caused President Obama to pause that pipeline. Of course, later Trump revitalized it. But anyway, that is, I think, the biggest thing that that nonviolent civil disobedience does, is to raise awareness and create the conditions for political action.
Awesome, thank you. There are 2 more questions before we take live questions. And just a quick heads up, if you need to hop off, feel free to do so. We'll stick around a few more minutes to answer any remaining questions, but if we'll need to leave, feel free to do so. I know we're over time. So thank you, Zach, for sticking around a few more minutes.
You bet.
All right, there was another question. What can we do to communicate better? Why does the public believe a snowball as evidence in favor of climate denial?
What do we need to do to communicate better? That's a great question. And it's a tricky one. A lie is a very difficult thing to combat, especially and just look at how we've struggled for 9 years. I can't believe it's been 9 years to figure out how to counter this man, Donald Trump, who lies as he breathes. The media doesn't know how to cover him. That people who his political opponents don't know how to talk about his lies. It's really hard because he is just completely unbounded by the norms that have governed our society for so long. Everything that he says is a lie, and it's just really difficult to know how to deal with that. But the bigger point here is that people sometimes talk about the marketplace for ideas, like the free market, again, is this idea that if you have the best ideas, if you have the best information, then that will survive in the marketplace of ideas and will go forward. That is complete bullshit. That is not how it works, because the way that our media ecosystem works is that if you have more money, you can buy a bigger megaphone. You can push your message out further. The way that algorithms on Facebook and Twitter and elsewhere work is that you can buy paid advertising. And so you have a message that says climate change is a hoax, and it will reach millions and millions of people because you are paying for it to. Meanwhile, climate scientists or climate advocates who don't have millions and millions of dollars, they have the correct message, they have the correct information, but they are drowned out by incredible amounts of disinformation. This, again, is a really hard thing to figure out how to counter. You can have the best crafted message in the world. Just you've worked for years to wordsmith it just right. This is going to appeal to swing voters. This is going to appeal to moderate people. This is going to appeal to the progressives. This is just the message of freedom, the message of the positive world that we can build if we move beyond fossil fuels. All the right elements of the message. And if you can't get it out there because you don't have millions and millions of dollars to do so, then you're sunk, right? So again, we come back to taking the fossil fuel industry out of power, because a huge part of that power is being able to get their message out. Just look at that in two times during this presentation. I talked about $100 million ad campaigns. One for the personal carbon footprint, one for the much newer, their lights on energy campaign to convince people that fossil fuels are necessary, are reliable. So it's a hard problem. The thing I would say, don't spend all your time wringing your hands about what's the perfect message. Figure out where the power is, do power mapping for and then reach the right people with the limited resources that we have as climate advocates. Reach the right people in order to take back power. And right now, the right people are in swing states. Okay.
Thank you. There was one last question on the Q&A, and then we'll maybe open up for live questions. Why does Warren Buffett not get involved in the role of finance? Do you have any opinion on that?
I don't know much about Warren Buffett or some of these. I know that Warren Buffett among billionaires he's not like the Koch brothers. He's not like Darren Woods, the CEO of ExxonMobil. But I don't think he's exactly a climate champion. So I'd love to see a few more Tom Steyers or Bill Gates who are actually using their billions to try to make a difference on this issue. But I can't speak for Warren Buffett.
Okay. Sounds good. Are there any live questions? If so, feel free to just go on mute and ask any questions. Maybe have time for one or two before we wrap up.
I have one. I'm curious, Zach, how much you feel that finding a job in climate where we're selling to other businesses or other consumers kind of falls in the middle of that spectrum you were showing us of small to large impact. So, a lot of folks in this chat are probably looking into making their companies more climate friendly or climate jobs. Is this something that we should be deprioritizing if we're looking for jobs in climate? Should we be prioritizing more looking for roles in climate government? That's kind of my question.
No, and in fact, if I'd had more time, and I went a full hour anyway, but if I'd had more time, I would have put within those real tools, real tools number 5 would have been make your job a climate job. And I really believe in that. Almost any, and you don't necessarily have to leave your current job in order to go find a climate job. Almost anything, except for fossil fuel executive, almost anything can be a climate job, because I would challenge you to find a single example of a company that is perfect on climate. I mean, any given company, you can be asking, is our money in a climate friendly bank? Are our investments in renewable energy and have no fossil fuel exposure? It is our vehicle fleet totally electric? Are we purchasing renewable energy from the grid? And very few do we have is our retirement account, our retirement plan, is that somewhere climate friendly? Do we have the ability for employees to make charitable donations to climate groups through this company? There's so many ways that companies can do more on climate, and very few are. And so whatever company you work for, you can be pushing them to do those things. And that's it. So in that way, any job can be a climate job. Definitely don't prioritize that. We spend I hope I didn't say definitely don't prioritize that. What I meant was definitely don't deprioritize that. Make that a priority, because our jobs, for better or for worse, we spend most of our waking lives at our jobs, and we can't afford to have most of our waking lives completely ignore climate. Now, here's the other thing that I would say is, if you want some inspiration on this way, listen to my favorite podcast, which is Volts with David Roberts, because he goes into it's storytelling of the people who are on the ground leading the renewable energy revolution. And so it's basically, he's interviewing people in clean tech who are building that future, and with all of the courage and public spirit that they're bringing to that work. And so a lot of people have been inspired by that show to move into their work in the clean energy revolution. But again, clean tech is only one part of what a climate job looks like. There's anything.
Awesome. Thank you. There was one last question in the chat, in the Q&A box that just came up. I think it was posted before in the chat. Do you see any value in carbon markets? And if yes, what kind of value?
Any value in carbon markets? Yes. So carbon markets trade emissions under some kind of emissions cap generally. What I can tell, voluntary carbon markets are a place of incredible fraud and grift. Over the last couple of years, one expose after another has just shown that voluntary carbon markets are just bogus. They're a way for people to make money with these shell games of trading financial products around. Well, no actual emissions cutting is happening. However, there are also regulated carbon markets, such as in the EU, and those are effective. That my understanding, although I'm not deep in this world of climate finance and public policy, but my understanding is that they are more effective would be just a straight up carbon tax to make fossil fuels more expensive, because that is a market signal that is more straightforward and more powerful than the ability for companies to trade around carbon credits. But regulated carbon markets are a real thing that's driving real change. And I think that the best example of that is happening in the EU. But I'm a little bit out over my toes here, because I'm not an expert in this area. But one thing I can say for sure, voluntary carbon markets are bullshit. But regulated carbon markets can have a place.
Thank you, Zach. There are no other questions in the Q&A, but just wanted to see if there are any remaining questions in the audience. Anybody who wants to ask one last question, maybe?
Thanks so much, everyone.
Oh. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you, Zach, for this inspiring talk. I'm always really inspired by that. And yeah, thanks for everyone who joined today, and have a great rest of your day and week. Zach, is there anything you wanted to say?
I'm trying to figure out how to send my chat to everyone, but I'm just putting my email in here, and I wish I had done that earlier. Oh, you know what? It was on the last slide, so hopefully most people saw that. That was I have two emails, but anyway, please use me as a resource. I'd love to talk about getting involved. So thank you again.
And the recording will be shared after this event, so hopefully folks can catch up with anything they missed. Great. Well, thanks again, Zach, and thanks to the rest of the audience. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.